Your brain is like a dead fish, she used to say, in front of everyone. Always. Then her son failed the Saturday. And only I, the stupid moron, helped him move forward. Growing up in our family meant walking on eggshells around her. She had this way of making every family gathering feel like a performance review where I was always failing. The woman had perfected the art of disguising cruelty as concern, wrapping her insults in fake worry about my future. Every time I brought home a report card, she would examine it like she was reading a death certificate, shaking her head dramatically and making sure everyone in the room knew just how disappointed she was in my academic performance. The worst part wasn't even the direct attacks. It was watching her treat her own son like he was made of glass while treating me like I was something she'd scrape off her shoe. During family dinners, she would go on and on about how brilliant he was, how he was destined for greatness, how lucky the world was to have such a gifted child. Meanwhile, if I dared to contribute anything to the conversation, she would cut me off with some comment about how I should focus on passing my classes before trying to sound smart. I remember one particularly brutal evening when I was maybe 14. We were at my grandparents' house for Sunday dinner, and somehow the conversation turned to school. I had actually done well on a science project, got an A-, which was pretty good for me at the time. I was excited to share it, thinking maybe this would be the moment she'd see me differently. Instead, she laughed this cold, bitter laugh and said something about how participation trophies were getting out of hand these days. Then she launched into a detailed explanation of how her son had already mastered concepts I was just beginning to understand, despite being 2 years younger than me. What really got to me was how she made it seem like my struggles were some kind of moral failing. Like I was choosing to be average, choosing to disappoint everyone. She had this theory that intelligence was purely a matter of effort and discipline, which meant that my mediocre grades were evidence of my lazy character. She would tell anyone who would listen about how she had tried to help me, how she had offered to tutor me, how she had given me every opportunity to succeed, but I was just too stubborn or too stupid to take advantage of her generosity. The tutoring sessions she mentioned were actually more like interrogations. She would sit me down at her kitchen table with my textbook spread out in front of me and proceed to quiz me on material I hadn't even covered in class yet. When I inevitably couldn't answer her questions, she would sigh heavily and mutter something about how she didn't understand how we could be related. These sessions always ended with her giving up in frustration and sending me home with a lecture about how I needed to try harder if I ever wanted to amount to anything. Her son, meanwhile, seemed to float through life on a cloud of his mother's praise and protection. He was quiet, almost invisible at family gatherings, speaking only when directly addressed and always deferring to his mother's opinions. I used to think he was just shy, but as we got older, I started to recognize the signs of someone who had learned that the safest way to avoid criticism was to avoid drawing attention to himself entirely. He had been so thoroughly convinced of his own brilliance that he never actually had to prove it, which meant he never developed the resilience that comes from facing real challenges. The irony was that while she was busy tearing me down and building him up, I was actually learning how to handle failure. Every bad grade taught me to bounce back. Every criticism forced me to develop thicker skin. Every moment of doubt made me more determined to prove myself. I wasn't naturally gifted, but I was becoming someone who knew how to work for what I wanted. Her son, on the other hand, was becoming someone who expected success to be handed to him. When high school started, the differences between us became more apparent. I was still struggling with some subjects, but I had learned how to study effectively, how to ask for help when I needed it, and how to keep trying even when things didn't come easily. Her son, despite all his supposed brilliance, seemed to panic whenever he encountered material that didn't immediately make sense to him. He had been so sheltered from academic difficulty that he had no idea how to cope with it. The real test came during our junior year when standardized testing season rolled around. Everyone was stressed about the SAT, but her son seemed particularly anxious. His mother had been telling everyone who would listen that he was going to score in the top percentile, that colleges would be fighting over him, that this test was just a formality before he claimed his rightful spot at an elite university. The pressure she had put on him was enormous, and I could see it eating away at him. I took the test on a Saturday morning in March, feeling nervous but prepared. I had spent months studying, taking practice tests, identifying my weak areas and working on them systematically. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was thorough. When the results came back a few weeks later, I was pleasantly surprised to find that I had scored well enough to get into several decent state schools. Not Ivy League material, but solid, respectable scores that reflected genuine effort and improvement. Her son took the test the following month, and when his results came back, The silence from that side of the family was deafening. No proud announcements, no bragging about scores, no talk of college recruiters beating down their door. Just quiet, awkward conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room. I didn't know the details at first, but it was clear that something had gone very wrong. Update 1. The truth came out during a family barbecue that summer. My cousin looked miserable, sitting alone at a picnic table while his mother made excuse after excuse for why he wasn't talking about college plans. Finally, my grandmother pulled me aside and explained what had happened. He had completely bombed the SAT. Not just scored lower than expected, he had genuinely failed to achieve the minimum scores needed for most four-year colleges. The revelation hit the family like a shockwave. This kid who had been held up as the golden child, the academic superstar, the future leader of America, had performed worse on the test than several of his supposedly inferior cousins. His mother was devastated, but not in the way you might expect. Instead of being concerned about her son's future or trying to figure out how to help him, she seemed primarily focused on damage control and blame assignment. She started spinning elaborate theories about how the test was biased, how the testing center had been too noisy, how he had been feeling sick that day but hadn't wanted to disappoint anyone by postponing. She talked about hiring expensive tutors and test prep specialists, about getting additional accommodations, about filing complaints with the testing organization. Anything to avoid acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, her son wasn't the academic prodigy she had convinced herself he was. Meanwhile, her son was falling apart. The kid who had spent his entire life being told he was brilliant was now facing the possibility that he might not be able to attend college at all. He had applied to several prestigious schools based on his mother's confidence in his abilities, but without decent SAT scores, those applications were essentially worthless. He was looking at a gap year, community college, or settling for a school with much lower admission standards. What made it worse was that he had never learned how to handle failure because he had been so carefully protected from it his entire life. While I had developed coping mechanisms through years of struggle, he was experiencing academic disappointment for the first time at age 17, and he had no idea how to process it. He became withdrawn, anxious, and started avoiding family gatherings altogether. I felt bad for him, but I also felt a weird sense of vindication. All those years of being told I was stupid, all those comparisons that made me feel worthless, all those lectures about how I needed to be more like him, suddenly none of that seemed to matter anymore. I wasn't celebrating his failure, but I was definitely appreciating the irony of the situation. The real turning point came when he decided to retake the test in the fall. His mother had hired an expensive tutor, bought every prep book on the market, and was basically treating his study schedule like a military operation. But after a few weeks, it became clear that the traditional approach wasn't working for him. He was getting more stressed, not more prepared, and his practice test scores weren't improving significantly. That's when something unexpected happened. He reached out to me directly, not through his mother or other family members, but in a private message asking if I would be willing to help him study. He explained that he had been struggling with the math section in particular, and he remembered that I had always been decent at math despite my other academic struggles. He was desperate, and he was willing to swallow his pride and ask for help from the cousin his mother had spent years dismissing as intellectually inferior. I was torn. Part of me wanted to tell him to figure it out himself, to experience the same kind of dismissal and lack of support that I had grown up with. But another part of me recognized that this wasn't really about settling scores with his mother. It was about helping someone who was genuinely struggling and had nowhere else to turn. He wasn't responsible for his mother's behavior toward me, and punishing him for her mistakes wouldn't accomplish anything positive. So I agreed to help him, but I set some ground rules. We would meet at the library, not at either of our houses, to avoid family drama. We would focus purely on the material, not on emotions or family history. And most importantly, his mother couldn't know about our study sessions. I didn't want her finding some way to take credit for my help or turn the situation into another opportunity to make me feel inferior. The first few sessions were awkward. He was used to being praised for every small effort, while I was used to having to prove myself constantly. He expected immediate results and got frustrated when problems didn't come easily, while I had learned that real learning takes time and repetition. But gradually, we found a rhythm that worked for both of us. What surprised me was how much I enjoyed teaching him. I had never thought of myself as particularly good at explaining things, but something about breaking down complex problems into manageable steps came naturally to me. Maybe it was because I had struggled with the same concepts myself and remembered what it felt like to be confused. I could anticipate where he would get stuck, and had developed strategies for working through those obstacles. More importantly, I started to see him as a person rather than just an extension of his mother's ego. He was actually pretty smart, but he had been so overprotected that he had never developed the problem-solving skills and persistence that come from working through difficult material independently. Once he stopped expecting everything to be easy and started accepting that learning could be challenging, he began making real progress. Update 2. Our study sessions continued throughout the fall, and I watched him transform from someone who panicked at the first sign of difficulty into someone who could work through complex problems methodically. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, just steady improvement built on consistent effort and growing confidence. He stopped apologizing for not understanding things immediately and started asking better questions about concepts he found confusing. The math section had been his biggest weakness, but we spent hours working through algebra, geometry, and basic statistics until the problems became familiar patterns rather than insurmountable obstacles. I taught him the same techniques that had helped me, breaking complex problems into smaller steps, checking answers by working backwards, and managing time effectively during the test. Nothing revolutionary, just solid fundamentals applied consistently. What really changed was his relationship with struggle itself. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing the satisfaction that comes from mastering something difficult through persistent effort. Instead of expecting immediate success, he started to appreciate the process of gradual improvement. He began to understand that intelligence wasn't about never being confused. It was about being willing to work through confusion until clarity emerged. His mother, meanwhile, remained completely unaware of our collaboration. She continued to focus on external solutions, better tutors, different prep books, optimal testing conditions, while missing the real work that was happening. She would ask him about his studies, and he would give vague answers about working with his official tutor, which was technically true since he was doing both. But the real breakthrough was happening in our quiet library sessions, away from her anxious hovering and unrealistic expectations. As the test date approached, I could see his confidence growing. He was still nervous, which was normal and healthy, but it was the nervous energy of someone who had prepared thoroughly rather than the panic of someone who felt unprepared. He had learned to trust his ability to work through problems even when the solution wasn't immediately obvious, and that mental shift was probably more valuable than any specific technique or strategy. The night before his test, he sent me a message thanking me for all the help and apologizing for his mother's behavior over the years. He said he had started to understand how wrong she had been about both of us, about me being stupid and about him being naturally gifted. He realized that the real gift wasn't avoiding challenges but learning how to meet them head-on. When the results came back 6 weeks later, the change in family dynamics was immediate and dramatic. He had scored well enough to get into several good schools, including a few that had been reach schools even with perfect scores. More importantly, he had proven to himself that he could overcome a significant setback through hard work and determination. The quiet kid who had hidden behind his mother's praise had become someone capable of facing real challenges. His mother's reaction was complex and revealing. She was obviously thrilled about his improved scores and immediately started bragging to everyone about his remarkable comeback. But there was something different in her tone, a subtle acknowledgement that this success had required real effort rather than just natural ability. She seemed to sense that something had changed in the dynamic, though she didn't understand exactly what. The real surprise came when she showed up at my house one evening in December, carrying a homemade apple pie and wearing an expression I had never seen before. She looked nervous, almost vulnerable, completely different from the confident, dismissive person who had spent years making me feel small. She asked if we could talk privately, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I held the power in our relationship. She started by thanking me for helping her son, though she didn't specify how she had found out about our study sessions. Maybe he had finally told her, or maybe she had figured it out on her own. Either way, she knew that I had played a significant role in his success, and she was there to acknowledge it. But this wasn't just about gratitude. It was about something deeper and more complicated. She talked about how proud she was of both of us, how she had always known we were both capable of great things, how family was supposed to support each other through difficult times. It was a complete rewriting of history, an attempt to pretend that the years of comparison and criticism had never happened. She wanted to move forward as if we had always been on the same team, as if she had always believed in my potential. I listened without saying much, watching her struggle to find the right words. This was clearly difficult for her, and part of me appreciated the effort she was making. But another part of me was frustrated by her inability to acknowledge the real harm she had caused. She wanted the benefits of reconciliation without the discomfort of genuine accountability. Final update. The conversation with my aunt lasted about an hour, and it covered territory we had never explored before. She talked about her own childhood, about feeling like she had to prove herself constantly, about wanting to protect her son from the kind of criticism she had faced growing up. She explained that she had pushed him so hard because she wanted him to be confident, and she had been critical of me because she thought it would motivate me to try harder. It was clear that she genuinely believed her intentions had been good, even if her methods had been damaging. She had convinced herself that tough love would make me stronger, that constant comparison would inspire both of us to reach our potential. She couldn't see how her behavior had created a toxic dynamic that hurt everyone involved, including her own son. But there was also something else in her explanation, a recognition that her approach had backfired. Her son's initial failure on the SAT had forced her to confront the possibility that her parenting strategy wasn't as effective as she had believed. Watching him struggle with something that should have been easy for such a gifted child had shaken her confidence in her own judgment. She asked me directly why I had helped him, especially after years of being treated poorly by her. It was a fair question, and one I had asked myself many times during our study sessions. The honest answer was complicated. I hadn't done it for her, and I hadn't done it to prove a point about forgiveness or taking the high road. I had done it because I recognized something in him that reminded me of myself, the fear of not being good enough, the pressure to live up to impossible expectations, the confusion that comes from not understanding why things that seem easy for others feel so difficult. Helping him had also helped me understand something important about my own journey. All those years of struggle, all those moments of feeling stupid or inadequate, had actually been building something valuable. I had developed resilience, persistence, and the ability to learn from failure, qualities that served me well not just academically, but in every area of life. My aunt's criticism hadn't made me stronger, but overcoming it had. The conversation ended without any dramatic declarations or tearful apologies. She thanked me again, promised to stay in touch, and left the pie on our kitchen counter. After she was gone, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. She no longer saw me as the family disappointment who needed to be managed or corrected. For the first time, she was treating me as an equal, someone whose opinion and abilities she respected. Her son and I continued to stay in touch throughout his senior year. He ended up choosing a school that was academically rigorous but not overly prestigious, somewhere he could continue growing without the crushing pressure of having to maintain a perfect image. He seemed genuinely excited about learning rather than just achieving, and he had developed the confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever challenges come your way. The experience taught me something valuable about the nature of success and intelligence. Real intelligence isn't about never struggling or always having the right answer immediately. It's about being willing to engage with difficult problems, learning from mistakes, and persisting through confusion until understanding emerges. It's about developing the mental habits that allow you to tackle new challenges rather than just demonstrating mastery of familiar material. Looking back, I can see that my aunt's harsh treatment, while painful at the time, had inadvertently prepared me for real life in a way that her protective approach with her son had not. I had learned to handle criticism, to bounce back from failure, and to find motivation within myself rather than depending on external validation. These weren't lessons I would wish on any child, but they had made me stronger and more resilient than I might have been otherwise. The whole experience also changed how I think about family dynamics and the long-term effects of how we treat each other. My aunt genuinely believed she was helping both of us by setting high standards and making clear distinctions between success and failure. But her approach had created a zero-sum dynamic where one person's success necessarily meant another person's failure, where love and approval were conditional on performance rather than inherent worth. When I helped my cousin, I was modeling a different approach, one where success didn't have to come at someone else's expense, where intelligence could be shared rather than hoarded, where family members could lift each other up instead of competing for limited approval. It wasn't about being the bigger person or proving anything to my aunt. It was about breaking a cycle that had been damaging for everyone involved. The apple pie sat on our counter for 3 days before anyone in my family tried it. When we finally cut into it, it was actually pretty good, not perfect, but made with care and attention. In a way, it reminded me that people are more complicated than we often give them credit for. My aunt wasn't just a cruel person who enjoyed making others feel small. She was someone who had her own struggles and insecurities, someone who had genuinely wanted the best for her family but had gotten confused about what that actually meant. I never did respond to her thank you that evening. Not because I was trying to be rude or make a point, but because I realized that some moments don't require words. The recognition in her eyes, the shift in her tone, the simple fact that she had shown up at my door, all of that said more than any conversation could have. For the first time in my life, I saw her seeing me clearly, without the filter of disappointment or comparison that had colored all our previous interactions. The story doesn't have a neat, Hollywood ending where everyone learns profound lessons and becomes best friends. My aunt and I are cordial now, but we're not close. Too much history, too many years of hurt feelings, too many ingrained patterns to overcome completely. But there's a mutual respect that wasn't there before, an acknowledgement that we both bring something valuable to the family dynamic. Her son is doing well in college, studying something he's genuinely passionate about rather than just something that sounds impressive. He still struggles sometimes, but he's learned to see struggle as part of the learning process rather than evidence of failure. More importantly, he's discovered that his worth isn't dependent on being the smartest person in the room. It comes from being willing to engage honestly with whatever challenges he faces. As for me, the whole experience reinforced something I had been learning gradually over the years, that success isn't about proving you're better than someone else, it's about becoming the best version of yourself. Helping my cousin succeed didn't diminish my own achievements, it enhanced them by giving them meaning beyond personal advancement. Sometimes the most satisfying victories are the ones where everybody wins.